everyone, welcome back to my channel. This week I'm going to be talking everything fantasy. So I myself am still on a fantasy journey, so in this video I'm not going to be including higher fantasy. However, I am going to be covering everything from cozy fantasy to fairy tale fantasies to gothic fantasies to popular fantasy series and some underhyped recommendations as well. So if you're new to fantasy and you're just wondering where to start, you've got no idea where to start and you need a little bit of help, or if you read high fantasy all the time and you're just needing something a little bit easier on the brain but still fantasy, then hopefully this video is going to give you some recommendations. So grab yourself a cuppa and I hope you enjoy this video. So these recommendations are going to kind of follow probably how I got into reading fantasy, because I started reading fantasy at the end of 2023. And I feel like the books that I've read have been a really nice way to get into the genre. I didn't really jump into anything too heavy to start with. So these recommendations are going to kind of go along with how I got into it and which ones I read and then went to. You can quite easily get put off by the genre because there's multiple books in series, there's books with complex world building, there's a lot to it when it comes to fantasy, and you can easily get very overwhelmed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the easier to follow fantasies, the cozy fairy tale fantasies and gothic fantasies to start with. And then I'll be talking about the more complex fantasies that you can go into. So I'm actually going to start with my favourite series of all time. They are the first fantasy books that I read, so it's the first ever duology that I read. That's the reason why I love this the most. I think when you read your first fantasy book or series, that is generally the one that you have most love for because it got you into it. There's just so many things that I love about this, so I'll stop going on about it and I'll let you know what I'm talking about. The books that I'm talking about is The Shepherd King duology by Rachel Gillig. So the first book is One Dark Window and the second book is Two Twisted Crowns. So the story is set in an eerie, mist-locked kingdom. The main character is called Elspeth and she has an ancient monster trapped inside of her head and she refers to him as the Nightmare. The Kingdom of Blunder is slowly being infected by dark magic, so she ends up meeting a highwayman and together they've got to find 12 Providence cards to find a cure. So yeah, when it comes to this book, it's gothic, it's immersive, it's atmospheric. Rachel Gillig's writing style is so lyrical and descriptive, and it ultimately just transports you to this kingdom, and it's just a gorgeous gothic read. I could talk about this series all day, to be quite honest, but if you're looking for something that's dark, it's gothic, it's an adult fantasy, it's easy to follow with a romance subplot, then I highly recommend The Shepherd King duology because, yeah, it's just perfect. Another duology that I want to talk about if you're looking for something that's still gothic, it's still cozy vibes, but it's got high stakes and is essentially about a witch and a witch hunter, then I recommend the Crimson Moth duology by Kristen Ciccarelli. So yeah, basically this book is about a witch and a witch hunter, and nothing can quite honestly get more high stakes than that. I highly recommend this book, and the second one is actually coming out this week, or well, by the time you're watching this video, the second book, The Rebel Witch, will have come out. If you're wanting something that's fast-paced, that's got a whole lot of twists and turns, easy to follow, short chapters, a dual point of view, read this. It's got everything from forbidden romance, forbidden magic, cat and mouse betrayals, and like I said, there's loads of twists and turns. The ending of The Crimson Moth is just, my jaw was on the floor. So yeah, I've been desperate to read the second book, so I'm very excited to get my hands on it. It's super easy to follow, it's a really interesting world, it's kind of like set in the Regency era, and yeah, the magic system is incredibly unique as well, especially, yeah, it's just quite powerful to read it as a woman. So I highly recommend The Crimson Moth. It's incredible, and again, it's just a nice, easy kind of gothic witchy book to read, so I recommend that one. So we're still talking about cozy fantasies. This next one is going to be a gothic fantasy, and then we're going to be finishing on a more fairy tale magical kind of fantasy. So the next one that I'm going to be talking about is a trilogy. It's a gothic fantasy trilogy, and it's the Belladonna trilogy by Adeline Grace. This follows Signa, who is an orphan raised by multiple relatives who basically only really care about her wealth. After Signa's aunt dies, she's then sent to live with her remaining relatives at Hawthorne Grove. This is a mysterious and spooky estate, and because of Signa's abilities, the Hawthorne mother's spirit claims that she was in fact poisoned. So Signa then decides to help and try to kind of find out who did it, and ends up forming an alliance with Death himself. This again is a Gothic spooky read. You can kind of tell, like last year I was really loving Gothic books. I myself love to watch Gothic kind of fairy tales and stuff like that. So yeah, you can kind of see like I really enjoy Gothic fantasy. So this one especially, it's so easy to follow. I love the writing style. It's spooky, it's mysterious, there's spirits. It's again set in the Regency era. The characters are all beautiful, and yeah, it's a lovely trilogy to read. And my favourite out of the whole trilogy is Wisteria, because yeah, I just love that book and it made me feel a lot of emotions. So if you're looking for something again, cozy, gothic, easy to follow, lovable characters, spooky vibes, I recommend the Belladonna trilogy. And finally, the last one that I'm going to be talking about in this kind of section is the Once Upon a Broken Heart trilogy by Stephanie Garber. These books are the most dreamy, magical fairy tale fantasy books I've read to date. The story follows Evangeline Fox, who has always believed in true love and happy endings, until she finds out that the love of her life is in fact due to marry someone else. So with all the heartbreak, she then strikes a deal with the Prince of Hearts. So like I said, this book is everything when it comes to magical fairy tale vibes, cozy fairy tale vibes. It just reminded me so much of all the fairy tales that I loved watching growing up and fairy tale books that I loved growing up. So as an adult, and if you're wanting to kind of relive all of those childhood fantasy fairy tale kind of vibes that we all loved so much, then I really do recommend this trilogy. It's also written in third point of view, which kind of emphasizes that fairy tale feeling even more. But yeah, it's another fun series, it's another fast-paced series. It's just a joy to read. I absolutely loved this. There's romance in it, it's enchanting, there's curses, there's potions, there's little creatures. And yeah, it's just everything when it comes to fairy tales. So I highly recommend this series. So we've spoke about the easier kind of fantasy books that you can read if you're wanting something easier for you guys that might be reading high fantasy all the time, or for beginners, just like I was last year. I needed something easy to kind of get myself into the genre. Those are the books I would always recommend. But now we're going to be moving into the more popular fantasy series. They're a bit more heavier on world building, have more spice in them, because the previous books that I've just spoken about have romance in them, but they're not spicy. So these ones are going to be a little bit more spicier. There's going to be a few that you're probably going to be very well aware of. So let's get into it. Starting off with the most well-known fantasy series, and if you've not heard of this series before, I would be very, very surprised. That's the acotar series by Sarah J. Maas. acotar, short for A Court of Thorns and Roses. This story follows Feyre, who kills a wolf in the woods, which then leads to her being captured and taken prisoner by a High Fae Lord. This High Fae Lord is from a magical kingdom, and this kingdom has an evil that's growing within the shadows. So this is a 5-book series. A lot of people have different favourites for this one. I know a lot of people's favourite is the second book, A Court of Mist and Fury. Personally, and a lot of people again have mixed emotions about the first book, A Court of Thorns and Roses, but I'm going to be honest, I actually loved the first book. I really loved it. It gave Beauty and the Beast vibes, so if you love Beauty and the Beast, then that's the vibe of the first book. It's so good, and I personally love world building. I love lots of world building if there is, because I'm a visual person. So if I've got very little world building, I really find it hard to kind of connect to the world. So for me, the more world building, the merrier. So I really did love the first book because of that. And then the action kind of starts happening towards the end of the first book. The second one as well is my favourite. When you get around to it, you will understand there's so many scenes in that book that just like, but yeah, this series will literally make you feel all of the emotions, and it's basically the holy grail when it comes to fantasy. But again, I read this one after I'd read The Shepherd King duology and Once Upon a Broken Heart. So I felt like I could go into this one quite easier, because at the time I was happy reading duologies, I was happy reading trilogies, but anything more than that I was a little bit scared of. But honestly, yeah, reading the acotar series, I read it in 2024 in January, and it was the best experience. So next up is the Empyrean series by Rebecca Yarros. So the first book is Fourth Wing and the second book is Iron Flame. The third book has just come out, which is Onyx Storm. So I'm going to be talking about the first book. So Fourth Wing follows Violet Sorrengail, who is supposed to be in the Scribe Quadrant, but she ends up being put in the Riders Quadrant. And a lot of people would like to, because of her name, it's got everything when it comes to high stakes, there's spice, the romances in this, and overall it's just an absolute adventure. And if you love dragons especially, then that's one reason to read this series. The dragons, yeah, they're everything in this. And I would also say, if you've watched the Divergent movies, then I think you'll love this, because it kind of reminded me of Divergent in a different way, but it still reminded me of it. And yeah, if you like the Divergent series, if you've watched the films or you've read the books, then I think you will love the Empyrean series. So next up, we're going to be talking about one of my favourite series and favourite authors that I've discovered so far. I enjoyed the Empyrean series. The Fourth Wing will always be my favourite out of that trilogy. Iron Flame and Onyx Storm are just a bit... And acotar, again, I enjoyed that for many reasons. Crowns of Nyaxia series by Carissa Broadbent is one of my favourite series. I love it so much. So the first book, The Serpent and the Wings of Night, follows Araya, who is an adopted daughter of the Nightborn Vampire King. She then enters the Kajari, which is a deadly tournament to prove that she is more than just prey, because you can imagine a human living in a world of vampires, you are quite literally prey in a world of predators. So yeah, she's super badass, she's headstrong, which I love to see with female main characters. And while she's within the Kajari tournament, she ends up forming an alliance with a vampire called Rain. Whether or not that's a good decision, read the book to find out. This again is incredibly easy to follow. I mean, I thought it was, because I really enjoy Carissa Broadbent's writing style. It's one of the reasons why she's like one of my favourite authors now, because I just find her books so easy to read. And I must say, out of the whole series, my favourite is, I will always love The Serpent and the Wings of Night, but there's just something about Six Scotch Roses, which is a novella to read in between Serpent and Ashes. It's just, the romance in that is just perfect. As I've said in reviews on Goodreadss or like other videos where I've done reviews of these series, every time I read a Carissa Broadbent book, it's like I just go into a daydream, just a daydream. I'm just completely like taken away from reality, and that's what you want from a fantasy book. And yeah, it's got everything from a badass FMC. The main male character he's one of my favourites. It's got romance, it's spicy, there's trials, and it's ultimately just lush. It's lush. If that sounds like something that you would enjoy, I highly recommend the Crown of Nyaxia series. But next up is a book that I've actually just read, or just finished reading this week, and it's now one of my god tier books. It's up there. It's going to be hard to pass. It's already top 3 books I've read so far this year. I had the best time reading this. The book I'm talking about is When the Moon Hatched by Sarah A. Parker, and the second book is actually due to come out this year as well, and I'm very excited to read the second book. This follows Rave, an assassin for a rebellious group, and Khan is our MMC, and he is a dragon rider on a quest of his own, and they end up finding each other, and basically they end up trying to seek out the truths of their world. When it comes to world building, this book world builds. It's everything that I want when it comes to world building. This book came with a glossary, and I love glossaries in books. For a lot of people it intimidates them, but it just helps with creating this world for me. I love it. If I've got tools to help me kind of imagine and relate to this world in my mind and connect to it, then I'm all here for it. So I loved the world building. I really loved the world building, and it sets off straight away. I honestly just found it so interesting because the world itself is so unique. And again, the world is set up with dragons, so we've got dragons in it. So anything that's got dragons in, I'm instantly going to read and I'm probably going to love. And I said in my review that I posted on Instagram and Goodreads this week that if you've watched Raya and the Last Dragon, which is a Disney film, it really made me think of that. Like, again, it's not directly relates to it, but it kind of had little elements that made me think of that film, and it's one of my favorite Disney films. So yeah, this fantasy book is more complex when it comes to world building, so it's probably not a book I would recommend reading straight away if you are a beginner reading fantasy. Yeah, it's got everything from a sassy, headstrong FMC, she's got really witty comebacks, an MMC that you quite frankly won't stop thinking about because he's just perfect, and a heartbreaking love story that will just break your heart. So I highly recommend When the Moon Hatched by Sarah A. Parker. It was so fun to read. We've done cozy fairy tale, fantasy, and gothic recommendations. We've done popular fantasy books that are a bit more complex on world building and have spice. Now we're going to be moving on to some recommendations that I just think are totally underhyped, deserve more love, and I really enjoyed these ones and I think people should read them. So the first underhyped recommendation I'm going to be talking about is the Sacred Stones trilogy by Kate Golden. So the first book is A Dawn of Onyx. Lucy also spoke about this trilogy in her YouTube video, and yeah, if Lucy's spoken about it as well, then you really should read these books. This story follows Arwen, who offers her life to save her brother. She's then taken prisoner by an evil king, the most evil king on the continent, to basically use her for her magical and rare healing abilities. And to escape this evil king, she's got to form an alliance with a fellow prisoner. So this is a Gothic trilogy. One thing that I really like about it, and I was drawn to it, is because the world's kind of set up in and inspired by crystals. And if you've watched my last YouTube video, you'll know I've got quite the collection of crystals. So that was one aspect that I really liked about it. But yeah, it's got everything from dark magic, there's creatures, we've got evil kings, we've got like a dark magic spooky forest. And if you like the trope, who did this to you, then need I say more? The next book that I'd like to recommend is Gallant by V. Schwab. This book I read last year, and if you like the film Coraline, then I believe you will like this book because it made me think of Coraline whilst I was reading it. The story follows Olivia, who has grown up in a school for girls. She doesn't speak, she sees ghosts, and all she has of her past is her mother's journal. A letter then arrives inviting Olivia to come home to Gallant, but when she arrives there's no one to greet her. This is a gothic spooky read, and it's a nice short read as well, so if you're kind of looking for a nice shorter read that's a bit spooky, bit mysterious, then I recommend Gallant by V. Schwab. It's got ghosts, it's got a creepy mansion, there's odd characters, and it's essentially a dark story about grief, mystery, secrets, and ultimately about a little girl who is just yearning to belong somewhere. And if that sounds like something you're interested in, give Gallant a read. The next book that I want to talk about is a book that really surprised me last year. I wasn't expecting to love it as much as I did. The book that I'm talking about is Where the Dark Stands Still by A.B. Poranek. This follows Liska, who lives in a little village. One day she ventures to the enchanted forest, accidentally unleashes her magic, which then leads her to be captured by the mysterious Leslie, which is the demon warden of the spirit forest. So she's captured and bound to a year of servitude in exchange for a wish. So this book is inspired by Polish folklore, so if you love folklore, anything like that, then that's one reason to read this book. And if you've read Belladonna and if you've read Gallant, or if you like the sound of both of those, then that's another reason to read this book, because yeah, it's got everything you could want. And also if you've read One Dark Window, Two Twisted Crowns, it's the same vibe. There isn't any spice in this, there is romance though, and it's got a mansion, and yeah, if you kind of like Howl's Moving Castle and again Beauty and the Beast, then this is another one to check out, because I just loved it. I loved this book so much. It's a great, dark, cozy fairy tale kind of fantasy to read, and I don't see a lot of people talking about it, so I really recommend that one. So my next underrated book that I don't think people actually know about really is A House of Salt and Sorrows by Erin A. Craig. I read this one whilst I was on holiday in Cape Verde in 2023, and I can vouch for this book being atmospheric because I was sat on poolside on a sun lounger, and there were some points where I actually completely forgot where I was for a bit. So House of Salt and Sorrows is a Gothic ocean inspired fairy tale, and I believe it's a retelling of the 12 Dancing Sisters, I think. The story follows Anna who lives at Heimar, which is a manor by the sea, with her sisters, her father and her stepmother. Once there were 12 sisters, now there's only 4 of them. Anna then becomes suspicious that these deaths are not in fact accidental, all while her sisters have actually been sneaking out to glittery balls every night. But who are they dancing with? Or what are they dancing with? Read the book to find out. This is a beautiful, gothic, descriptive, at times creepy book. It's not a standalone, it is a duology. I've not read the second book yet, but to be honest, you could quite easily read this book as a standalone. It's a story that'll completely immerse you whilst reading, and it'll also leave you wondering what's real and what's not. If you think of a dark Victorian village that's on the coast, it's constantly raining, it's dark, it's mysterious, it's creepy. I thought the beliefs of the people that live in that town was quite interesting as well, because it's all ocean inspired. So I really recommend reading this book and giving it a go. So we're coming towards the end of this video, but I've got a special mention that I want to include because it is one of my favourite books I've ever read. It's still sitting at the top for me because it's just incredible in so many ways, and that's A Diary of Blood by S.T. Gibson. This book is dark, it's lush, it's haunting, and it's a book that will completely hypnotise you and consume you whilst reading, because that's what it did for me. So the book is set up as a farewell love letter written in the perspective of Constanta, which is Dracula's first bride. It's an account of centuries of their lives together from beginning to end. You see the cost of obsession, jealousy, manipulation, the abuse of power, seduction, lust, love, all of those things are in this book. So I would also check your trigger warnings before starting this. There's a full list at the front of the book, but it is phenomenal. The writing is so lyrical, and Ashley mentions this in her YouTube video. She mentioned that this book is so incredibly highlightable, it's unreal, and she is correct. This book, whenever I decide to reread this, which will be at some point, it's just going to be jam-packed with tabs, because the amount of gorgeous quotes and relatable quotes and beautiful quotes, it's just jam-packed full of it. The emotions that you see in that book are very raw, they're very real, they're very intense. So again, check trigger warnings before reading this book. One of the main reasons why I love this so much is because Constanta takes back her power, and Dracula is never named in this book. She never gives him a name in her story, and yeah. I closed this book and I was speechless. It's breathtaking. If I can recommend any book for you to read, it would be this one. It's not a book that I would recommend to younger readers. It's very dark, it's quite triggering. If I could give this infinity stars, then I would. So yeah, I just wanted to end on this little special mention because yeah, it's incredible and I highly, highly recommend it. So that's it. Those are my fantasy book recommendations if you're looking for cozy fantasies, if you're looking for fairy tale fantasies, if you're looking for gothic fantasies, and if you're looking for more popular kind of romantasy books that's got spice in them. Those are my main recommendations of books that I've read so far. If you've got any recommendations that I haven't mentioned, I'd love to know if you have anything that you think I'd enjoy, and it might also help some people out who are watching this video as well. But yeah, I hope you all enjoyed this video. It's been really fun to talk about all my favourite books and fantasy series that I've read so far. I will probably do a separate video on fantasy books that I've got on my TBR, because I've got quite a lot of fantasy books that I have on my physical TBR for this year. But yeah, I really hope you've enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed it, I would love it if you could give it a like or a comment, or If you feel like it, I would love it if you could subscribe as well. But yeah, I hope you're all having a lovely morning, afternoon or evening wherever you are, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!